Most people think the date of the September 11th attacks was a twisted joke about the American emergency phone number. But the real reason dates back over 300 years. By 1683, the massive Ottoman Empire was rapidly conquering Christian Europe. Their forces finally cornered the Austrian capital of Vienna. But on exactly September 11th, a massive European coalition army arrived. They violently shattered the siege, permanently halting Islamic expansion. This devastating defeat opened the door to centuries of west of encroachment into the Middle East. It was a deep historical humiliation that completely obsessed Osama bin Laden. So in 2001, he weaponized the exact anniversary of that ancient battlefield. To him, the Twin Towers falling would signal a violent turning of the tide, launching a new era of Islamic dominance. The date wasn't a cheap numerical taunt at American first responders. Instead, it was a deeply calculated 300-year-old plot designed for ultimate historical revenge.
Privilege and ideology, the Afghan catalyst, founding the base, global expansion, and finally the ultimate target. Phase 1, privilege and ideology, building the wealth and mindset. To really grasp the foundations of al-Qaeda's reach, we actually have to start with Osama bin Laden's early life in Saudi Arabia. He grew up in an incredibly privileged environment. He was born into a billionaire construction family, the Saudi bin Laden Group, which had deeply lucrative, very close ties to the Saudi royal family. And to put that privilege into perspective, just look at this number, $30 million. When his father passed away, bin Laden stood to inherit upwards of $30 million from the estate. It is absolutely crucial to understand this fact, because this immense personal wealth provided a ready-made, unrestricted financial foundation. He didn't have to scramble to fund his early operations. The bankroll was already built in. But of course, wealth needs a direction. And for bin Laden, that direction was forged during his university days in the late 1970s. While studying at King Abdulaziz University, he fully embraced pan-Islamism. This is basically an ideology seeking to unify the Muslim world and completely push out Western influence. He was especially influenced by the writings of an Islamic scholar named Syed Qutb. Qutb argued for a very rigid interpretation of Islamic law and had a fiercely anti-Western sentiment, and his work fundamentally shaped bin Laden's strict ideological worldview. Which brings us to Phase 2. The Afghan catalyst, a testing ground for war. Ideology and money are a potent mix, for sure, but they usually need a spark, a catalyst, to turn into action. That spark arrived at the very end of December 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Almost immediately, tens of thousands of men flooded into Afghanistan to fight off the Soviets. These fighters became known as the Mujahideen. Now, right after his studies, bin Laden traveled to neighboring Pakistan. And this is where he put that massive inherited fortune to work. He started funding, recruiting, and training these Mujahideen fighters before sending them into the treacherous Hindu Kush Mountains to wage a really grueling guerrilla war against the Soviet army. By 1984, he had helped set up Maktab al-Khidmat. Think of it as a regional support network purely dedicated to funding and training fighters for that specific Afghan-Soviet conflict. But as that war began winding down, we see a massive, critical shift. Instead of just packing up and going home, the most extreme wing of this group morphed into al-Qaeda in 1988. They pivoted from a localized anti-Soviet insurgency into a syndicate with a, frankly, global ambition to wage holy war against non-Muslims all over the world. So, let's look at Phase 3, founding the base, from regional insurgency to global network. The name al-Qaeda literally translates to the base or the foundation, and this new foundation was built on two very specific objectives: removing American influence from the Middle East and establishing a rigid fundamentalist rule across the Muslim world. But here's the thing. They obviously couldn't fight conventional wars against superpowers, so from day one, their chosen operational method was terrorism. Geopolitics really accelerated their radicalization here. In 1988, the Soviets withdraw. But then, in 1990, after Iraq invades Kuwait, U.S. troops are stationed in Saudi Arabia to prep for the Gulf War. Bin Laden was absolutely outraged by this. The idea of Western troops being invited into the kingdom that houses Islam's holiest sites furioused him. He publicly went after the Saudi royal family, and this was a fatal breach. By 1991, the Saudi government officially expelled him from his own home country. And that triggers Phase 4, global expansion, building the infrastructure of terror. Being expelled didn't shut him down. Actually, it did the exact opposite. It forced the organization to decentralize, look for new safe havens, and essentially build an international infrastructure. In 1992, he moves to Sudan, setting up well-defended compounds and training camps. But fast forward to 1996, crippling U.S. sanctions on Sudan force him out again. This time, he heads back to Afghanistan, sheltering under the protection of the Taliban. And it's widely believed that losing a chunk of his wealth and being exiled a second time radicalized him even further. That very same year, he officially issues a declaration of war against the United States, which escalates rapidly to the major embassy bombings just 2 years later in 1998.
Now, to understand their explicitly stated motive for escalating to international terrorism, we really just have to look at their own words. In 1998, al-Qaeda released a statement saying, "For 7 years, the United States has been occupying the lands of Islam in the holiest of place." This specific grievance, American troops in the Arabian Peninsula, was the primary core justification they broadcasted to the world for their violence.
And by 1998, the scale of that violence was truly devastating. Take a look at the data from the simultaneous U.S. embassy bombings in East Africa. In Nairobi, they used 500 cylinders of TNT, which resulted in 213 deaths. At the exact same time in Dar es Salaam, they detonated two 2,000-pound bombs, killing 85 people. Thousands more were injured. This wasn't just a random attack. It showed an incredibly sophisticated logistical capability that immediately put global intelligence agencies on high alert.
Which brings us to the final phase, Phase 5, the ultimate target, the 9/11 attacks. Following the embassy bombings, al-Qaeda turned its sights toward a massive, incredibly calculated plot to strike directly on American soil. The logistics behind the September 11th plot were cold, methodical, and literally took years to execute. Step 1. Back in 1999, they started screening candidates in Afghanistan who could speak English and blend into Western society. Step 2. By 2000, these chosen individuals were setting up sleeper cells inside the U.S. Step 3. The final plan was to hijack commercial airliners and fly them into highly symbolic buildings. And here's a fascinating, chilling historical detail. Sources suggest they didn't pick the date September 11th because of the 911 emergency number. It was actually chosen to mirror September 11th, 1683, the day the Christian siege of Vienna broke Ottoman expansion. Bin Laden literally intended the date as a symbolic turning of the tide back in favor of his extremist vision. On the morning of September 11, 2001, that horrific timeline unfolded exactly as the 19 hijackers planned. At 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 struck the North Tower. 17 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., Flight 175 hit the South Tower. At 9:37 a.m., Flight 77 struck the Pentagon. And finally, at 10:03 a.m., Flight 93 crashed into a field in Pennsylvania, only because the passengers valiantly tried to fight back and wrest control from the hijackers. And because the media broadcast this globally as it was happening in real time, the psychological impact was completely unparalleled in world history.
The human cost of that single morning is just staggering. Over 2,700 people lost their lives across the towers, the Pentagon, and on those 4 planes. And that doesn't even account for the thousands more who suffered ancillary injuries and severe health complications that would tragically cut their lives short in the years that followed.
In the immediate aftermath, a U.S.-led coalition invaded Afghanistan. This launched a massive manhunt that would span a literal decade. Bin Laden narrowly escaped capture at the Tora Bora cave complex in December 2001, slipping over the border into Pakistan. By 2005, he was living in a custom-built, heavily fortified compound in Abbottabad. He managed to hide there for years, right up until the CIA finally tracked his courier. On May 2, 2011, U.S. Navy SEALs executed Operation Neptune Spear, stormed the compound, and killed him. But here is the absolutely vital takeaway. Osama bin Laden died in that compound, but the ideological and logistical foundation he built, it didn't. His brand of violent extremism permanently altered the world. Al-Qaeda's blueprint, their specific methods of funding, training, and exploiting global media, persisted. In fact, it's exactly what enabled subsequent, even more brutal splinter groups like ISIL to rise up, exploit power vacuums in places like Syria and Iraq, and seize massive amounts of global territory in the 2010s.
Which leaves us with a really difficult final thought. Bin Laden is dead, yes, but his infrastructure of terror reshaped global security forever. Understanding these foundational building blocks is so critical today because it forces us to face a very tough question. How do we go about dismantling an ideology that so easily outlives its founder? Thank you for joining me for